Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing this evening? Good. Well, very happy Diwali to all of you. My name is Varun Soni. I'm the Dean of Religious Life here at the University of Southern California. I'm so grateful to our sponsors this evening, the Levin Institute for Humanities and Ethics, the Office of Religious Life, and USC Spectrum. I'm also thankful to the Department of Political Science and the Center for Feminist Research for all their support with this event. And I'm especially grateful to all of you for being here this evening. This evening's event, Women in War, featuring Nimmi Gowrinathan, will explore complex issues that disparately impact women in the theater of war. While women are often framed as victims in war zones, they are often also political actors, occupying a variety of roles in violent spaces. Women are, by and large, disproportionately impacted by the fallout of war, especially in terms of displacement, militarization, and rape. These experiences shape women in marginalized communities in distinct ways. In Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, lived experiences with violence often shapes the politics of women, forcing us to recognize that women can be both victims and agents in complex conflicts around the world. We are so fortunate today to be able to explore these timely issues with my very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan, who is an expert on gender and violence and the creator of Deviarchy.com. She is currently a fellow at the Center for Conflict Negotiation and Recovery, and she is also the lead author for the United Nations Human Development Report on Afghanistan, analyzing socio-economic indicators from a gendered perspective. She has recently been a policy consultant for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and the International Crisis Group, researching and analyzing gender inclusion in peacebuilding and women's insecurities in conflict zones. She is also developing a special series on women in/at war for Vice News on HBO. She was formerly the director of South Asia programs and the United Nations representative for Operation USA, which is an international disaster relief organization. In this capacity, she has lived and worked in Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan, monitoring small grants to community-based organizations. Dr. Gowrinathan received her undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University, her PhD in political science from UCLA, but we'll forgive her for that. She has published both academic articles and journalistic pieces on humanitarian intervention and gender for Foreign Affairs, Huffington Post, monkeykage.org, Humanitarian Practice Network, Oxford Stare Review, the World Policy Institute, and Gawker.com. Her recent article, The Women of ISIS, made a big splash. She was on MSNBC and the BBC talking about that recently. And for everyone here who is doing field research, who may be in a doctoral program and is thinking about how to do field research in difficult areas, Dr. Gowrinathan provides an inspiring model for all of us. She really is the antithesis of an armchair scholar. And I think she also expands the limits of what we think of in terms of the utility of a PhD. She's not just an academic, she's also a researcher, an advocate, a humanitarian aid worker. She works with nonprofit organizations, with government organizations. So in so many ways, I believe that Nimmi is a signpost for a new type of research that translates into policy in a day and age where we desperately need it. So the format of this evening's event will be as follows. Dr. Gowrinathan will first speak on the topic of women in war, and then she will facilitate a question and answer session with all of you, and I'm sure she'll stay afterwards to talk with all of you individually as well. With all that being said, please join me in giving a very warm Trojan welcome to our very special guest this evening, Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan.
Hi. This is a very special talk for me, not just because it was organized by our very close friend, Varun, but because my family is here, which almost never happens. And third, because I worked here like 12 years ago as an administrative assistant for a think tank, and my boss was really, really awful. So I feel like I'm coming back here, in a much stronger position this time. I'm going to talk today about women in war, but really I'm going to talk about Tamil women in Sri Lanka, because they've really been at the center of everything that I've done. I'm not going to give a long history to the conflict in Sri Lanka because that tends to go on and on, but Fundamentally, there was a 30-year war in Sri Lanka that ended in 2009, where the government of Sri Lanka, which essentially represented a majority Sinhalese population, defeated the liberation tigers of Tamil fighting for a separate state for the Tamil community. It's much more complicated than that, but I'm hoping we get into more of the nuances of gender and violence and less of the history there. So in this war, Tamil women were victims, they were agents, and they were sort of everything in between. So for me, Sri Lanka is not just about Sri Lanka, it's about what this case tells us about the potential and the scope of women's political engagement. My career has fundamentally revolved around the needs of these women. It's followed a non-traditional path because it has followed the position of these women. So I started off going back to Sri Lanka after the war, during peace, with some friends who are here, to do an orphanage and leadership program, and essentially at that time I was a volunteerist, discovering my roots and living in an orphanage with young girls and women. Then when the tsunami struck, I was an aid worker. I was meeting the immediate needs of the girls by sort of going around and putting these charitable band-aids on everything that needed to be done. And then the war started again, and I watched a lot of the young girls that I knew take up arms to join the fight. So I studied why it was they were doing this. As it ended, I became an advocate. I felt like if I could go to the UN, if I could go to the State Department, if they only knew how many people were dying a day at the end of the war, that they would actually do something. After it was all over, it seemed like the thing to do would be to expose the human rights violations happening to the women, particularly in the North and East. So I did a 2-year study of women who were raped, and presented it to, Madam Hillary Clinton herself. And through all this, I was writing, because writing for me was cathartic, but I also found that if I could write these stories in different ways, and I could speak to different audiences, I could speak to a policy audience, to an academic audience, to general people who cared about women in war. So I think at some ways in this stage in my career, a lot of what drives me is a sense of failure in all of these endeavors. I was in Sri Lanka last year, and someone told me the position of Tamil women is worse than it's ever been. So I think what pushes me now is to see what it is that we're missing. What is the aspect that we were missing in all of this, that there wasn't able to be a shift for these women at all. So when you're looking at women in war, I think you have to start with thinking about your own assumptions about women, right? Our assumptions about women, particularly in the developing world. The first one is that women are more peaceful than men. People don't say that as much anymore. It's not as commonly said, but it is underlying how we think about women. We believe fundamentally that women are more peaceful than men. The second is that when women get involved in things like rebellions or things like revolution or rebel movements, they're not doing it on their own. They're just sort of pawns of this project that men are doing, right? Both of these ways of looking at women deny them any sort of politics, any sort of agency in their own lives. There's some very clear examples that show us that the way that we're looking at women as more peaceful becomes problematic for both men and women. If you look at Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, right, she's sort of heralded as the peaceful woman. And it's much harder to see women as violent, but even if we look at this woman who's supposedly more peaceful, because we're not willing to see her politics, we don't see the ways in which she is actually supporting some very violent actions against a minority community there, right? Because we don't want her to have a politics, she just has to be peaceful. Even if you look at how this affects boys, I just had a meeting with the vice chair of the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development at the UN as they're looking post-2015 at the world and the biggest issues. And she says, it's really terrifying. The biggest problem today is that you have this rise in young boys in fragile states. And the language was sort of strange to me. Why would it be terrifying that a young boy was born in a state that's at war? And that was the entire focus of her presentation, looking at the percentage of young boys in fragile states and why we should all be terrified of this. So again, the assumption works the other way. They're necessarily born into violence if they live in a conflict zone. If you look at war, there are all these various aspects of war, right, that we look at just as outcomes of war, but not as political acts within war, right? So things like militarization. People just assume that there's a bigger military because there is a war. It is actually a political act to have a bigger military, to spread that military, to have it control populations. That is a political act. Displacement, we look at displacement as just sort of what happens in a war. also a political act. Keeping people in refugee camps, keeping them in places where they cannot engage with society, that is a political act. And specifically with women, rape. We look at rape as any number of things, but we don't look at it as a political act, right? So most of my work has been in showing how these things affect women, how it has a political impact on women. In Sri Lanka, recently there was a survey that found that nearly 1/3 of the north and east was occupied by the military. And I was with actually a very famous civil rights leader recently in New York, and we were talking about the militarization of the police in Ferguson right now. And initially, it was great because acknowledging that the police were militarized became this mobilizing tool, and all of a sudden, white liberals were joining the fight for, justice and equality. But then the concern became they joined only on that issue because they believe that that's sort of outside of racial politics, right? Fundamentally, any progressive in this country doesn't want the police to be militarized. But then you're taking the race out of it. You're taking the politics out of it, right? So militarization is not apolitical. And the thing with militarization is what it means is that the state and this sort of public entity intrudes into private spaces, right? Very private, very intimate spaces. And in most of these countries, and in Sri Lanka, those spaces are occupied by women. They are going to be the ones that feel the impact of militarization. The women that I worked with in the Northeast, the military is responsible for every aspect of their daily life. Who gives them food? Who gives them water? Where they go to the bathroom? How they walk to school? The route that they take to school, right? Every aspect of your life is determined by the military. That's a very intrusive force, and most problematically, the military determines your security. So the rise in prostitution in the Northeast comes from this bartering system between women and the military because they are now responsible for their security because there is no civilian police force in that area. So women's vulnerability in this context becomes very central. When I go back to Sri Lanka, a lot of the times I'm very concerned that people are going to find out that I'm Tamil or there's going to be an issue with the military. And I can remember very clearly one time being at a checkpoint and coming back from a meeting and sort of late at night. And these group of army guys, surrounded the rickshaw. And in that moment, you're thinking it doesn't matter whether you're Tamil or Sinhalese, it's just that you're a woman. That's what's going to put you in danger, and particularly in a militarized context. Nothing is going to help you if something happens in that moment, right? So you are constantly struggling with these multiple identities. And women who lived under the Tigers lived under what I call dual militarization because on both sides of their lives, everything was militarized. The second thing is displacement. So I think when you look at like a repressive state, everybody wants to see, well, she saw her dad's head blown off, right? So that became this deep repressive moment for her, and therefore she joined the Tigers. But state repression doesn't have to show itself in these very dramatic ways. It usually does show itself in very dramatic ways, but if you look at something like displacement, right? If you've ever been in a refugee camps are some of the most profoundly sad places in the world, right? So these experiences that are happening in refugee camps, you have moms who have to go to the hospital to give birth, so they have to leave their kid in a camp where nobody can watch the other 3 children, right? It's the women who usually wait in line for food rations for 3 or 4 hours. They're standing in line. It's the women who are sitting all day. And I know it sounds strange to think of sitting as, some form of suffering, but they're just sitting in these camps in the dust all day, every day for 10 years, right? That has to be a form of repression, particularly if they were put in that position for a reason, for a political reason, right? So displacement also, it's not just something that we should worry about women as victims and being vulnerable in that situation, but that it's going to affect their politics. And finally, rape. I did a 2-year study for the International Crisis Group on women who were raped. And one of the women I met, I was sort of hiding out in a church. Sorry, Mom. And there were a group of women who had been raped by the military. And one of the women that I was talking to, she said, I can't go home because I can't tell my father. Right? So she's already on the outside of her family. Then she said, I can't go to the village because I'm an ex-combatant. So that'll bring, suspicion on the village. So now she's on the outside of the village. She's been raped, so she's on the outside of her community because she can't go to weddings or funerals because it's bad luck. And then she's a Tamil, so she's on the outside of the state. So she's in this place of the extreme that we never talk about, which is extreme marginalization, right? She's out here where she doesn't belong to anything. And the only way, that we know to deal with these women is generally through humanitarian intervention, right? How do we deal with the question of this woman who is so marginalized that she can't fit in anywhere? I can be critical about this because I've participated in them. In this sort of study of suffering, there tend to be these fads that come and go, right? Right now, women's empowerment is it. This is the fad that we're working with right now. Unfortunately, rather than sort of being a serious examination of what women need in the developing world, we deal with women in these positions with chickens and cows and sewing machines. Really, she's all the way out here, and we're like, here's a sewing machine. It's going to bring you all the way back across all these layers into the mainstream of society, and you're going to be a productive member after you were raped and, fought in the war and all this stuff. I met one woman in the Vanity last year, and she said, I don't know, this international group came by. She had been raped. She was an ex-combatant. She's got 3 kids. And they gave me 3 chickens. And she said, Nimmi, they said, tomorrow they're going to come back and they're going to give the cages and the feed. Never came. She said, now I have, chickens can't survive in the jungle. It's like, now I have 3 children, 2 dead chickens, and 1 alive chicken that's torturing the youngest child. Right? Never mind the fact that she's raped, she's got to chase a chicken around now that can't survive in the jungle. So these are and this was a major NGO. This is not a small group that's doing this. I did sort of a preliminary survey of how major NGOs deal with women who are raped in the Congo and elsewhere. Almost every single one, sewing machines, bakeries, soap making, anything in this tiny livelihood category, right? The problem with that is that, yes, you have this woman come and she has something to do every day and, she doesn't actually make any money. There is no economic empowerment, maybe $1 a week or something. But somebody came up with a theory that if she has a little bit of economic power, that $1 a day, then she's going to be able to stop rape. Somehow this is going to stop rape. But the link to me seems like it doesn't make any sense at all. When I was at the State Department recently, one woman who was the head of the women's group or whatever, State Department ambassador for women, she was South Asian actually, and she was like, no, this all sounds great, politics of women, but we're really looking for a clean intervention. And the word was so strange to me, what that meant, a clean intervention. You're going into a messy situation. There is no clean intervention into this kind of work. So these things, rape and militarization and displacement, they're not just going to make women sad. They're not just going to make them disconnected from their families. They're going to have a political impact. Now, I'm not saying if someone's raped, one day they didn't think about politics, and the next day, all of a sudden they're a nationalist or a federalist or something, right? But they are going to change the way they think about justice, the way they think about equality, the way they think about revenge, the way they see fairness around them, right? That is political. It will have a political impact. And if you don't recognize that, when we recognize that women have politics, what we offer them is these formal positions as MPs, in the parliament in Afghanistan or in Sri Lanka, we say, well, you're going to have 6 seats here. There's been plenty of studies done that show that the women in Afghanistan have actually done less for women's rights than the men in Afghanistan parliaments have done. The problem with that is you're working with institutions where the men don't have any power. Why would the 6 women that you put in there have any power at all? Right? But that becomes the political solution. We put them in parliament in these places. So if there's no nonviolent outlet for women and they've suddenly realized that they think differently about justice and equality and revenge, what are they going to do? What are the options available to them? They will engage in violence in some form or another. They will be mobilized by a movement that's able to see this woman is feeling outside of the space. We're going to offer her a place to belong. And that was the Tigers, and it was, any number of groups. So once you acknowledge that women join these movements, right, that females are fighters, it's not just men. People always ask me, so what is it, what's the reason? Why do they join? There's not one reason. I mean, there's women who I met who joined because they were in love with someone in the movement. There's women who, didn't want to get married to an arranged marriage, so they joined the movement. There's women who needed security, women who needed money, women who were slightly mentally ill, maybe depressed, didn't feel like they belonged, so they joined the movement. We sort of allow ourselves all of these idiosyncrasies and these complex personalities when we look at women in the third world. It's always this homogenous third world woman that she's supposed to be, right? There's no variation there. If you do have to look at what it is that's the pattern between these women, between female fighters, whether it's in ISIS or the Tigers or any movement, it generally is some form of state repression. That at some point in their lives, they experienced a form of state repression, even if it wasn't being raped, the fear of rape, that shaped how they thought about politics, right? I just did the piece that Varun mentioned on women of ISIS, and fundamentally what it's saying is that any woman has these multiple identities. She's a Tamil, she's a Christian, she's a low caste, she's a woman, or you're a Sunni and you're a woman. You will choose the fight that is going to save your life, right? Being a woman in Northeast Sri Lanka, it's a little patriarchal, there's some sexism. You're not going to die. Being a Tamil in Northeast Sri Lanka, you will die. So you're not going to fight for women's rights. You're going to fight for Tamil rights. That doesn't mean you're not concerned with women's rights. It means that you are fighting for Tamil rights. The same with ISIS, the same with most of these other groups. And the threat to their identity as a Tamil, as a Sunni, as whatever is real. I mean, people always put it on the propaganda of the movement and that it's just the movement that convinces you that this is true. There's been plenty of studies that find that the propaganda does not work if they have not had enough real experiences to reinforce that. It's very hard to get a woman in a tiny village with 3 children in a conservative community to all of a sudden take up arms, unless there's something bigger driving that, bigger than propaganda, bigger than forced recruitment. And another aspect where we deny these women political agency is when we look at them purely through a feminist lens. There's this thing with ISIS now that we were talking about earlier, this good Muslim, bad Muslim, trope that we had before. Now there's a good female fighter and the bad female fighter. The ISIS women are terrorists, but the Kurdish women who are fighting them are the good female fighters, right? But the Kurdish women who are fighting them were a part of a terrorist group. They have been a part of the terrorist group. And there's this article in the New York Times that say, very sort of sensationalist, women in Kurdistan are fighting ISIS and sexism. No, they're not. Women in Kurdistan for years and years and years have been fighting for an independent political space. And the women that I met actually in Canada, there was an alliance between Kurdish women and Tamil women. And some of the former fighters said that our goal is complete political freedom. That is their goal. That's why they're fighting ISIS. They are not fighting sexism. So we struggle with this idea of liberation. We want women to be liberated in some form through the movement, outside the movement. And it's shocking to us that women like women in ISIS would join a movement that's oppressive to women. Almost every movement in every country that there have been female fighters, Eritrea, Nepal, the movement itself has been repressive to women. That's not why they joined the movement. There is this moment of sort of battlefield liberation, right? There's this bubble when you're on the field that women will tell you, well, I was fighting next to a guy and I felt equal to a man and my opinion was listened to and we were the head of, in the Tigers, they were the head of military battles that did really well. So you definitely have that moment where they feel a sense of liberation. There is a shift in the dynamics. But unfortunately, it usually exists in that bubble, in that temporary space of the war. There was a woman that I met outside of the Tigers she was in combat boots and she was walking around and she was nailing up these signs on the church doors that said how women should dress. You should wear a long skirt, and that you should wear a bicycle. On the bicycle, you should sit sideways, and you should have earrings, and you should always wear a hat because of the sun. It just seemed like a strange thing. Why would this woman in boots be putting up this very conservative approach to how women should behave? But if you talk to her about it, what she said is, what else are we fighting for if not the Tamil culture, right? Any of these movements, they have to create an identity. They have to say, this is what it means to be Tamil. This is what it means to be Sunni. This is what it means to be Eritrean. And most identities are rooted in gender roles. That's how you come up with a cultural identity, right? So you can't challenge that. That is what they're fighting for. They're fighting to protect these values that they feel are under threat by somebody, the Sinhalese state or the Americans or somebody, right? You're going to hold on to what you believe is under threat. You're going to make it more traditional, more conservative, so that nobody else can take that away from you. To me, and I don't think that women weren't aware of the patriarchy. Saying that it wasn't a women's rights fight doesn't mean women in the Tigers knew very well that there were patriarchal elements to it, that men were in charge fundamentally. This just wasn't their fight at the moment. They were hoping that once they got the nation, which never happened, that they would deal with the women's question after that. So fundamentally, if you're trying to locate peace intrinsically within women, you miss the sort of individual politics that sustain war. That's the problem with how we're looking at this stuff. So after, in the post-conflict period, there are these barriers in Sri Lanka to political action. If you look after the war is over, now it's technically an occupied area of the north and east. There is this backlash towards conservatism, and people say, well, that's the Tamil culture, people are becoming more conservative. I don't know if it is culture, honestly. I think it's survival. I think that if there's military people everywhere and you have a young daughter, you're probably going to keep her home. Not because of your culture, but because there was a lot of young girls who just got raped by walking outside. So we conflate these two things. But there is going to be a bigger impact of this. One of the priests in Sri Lanka said that the impact on women is going to be that people will think, well, look, see, this is what happens when women join politics. And you see all these fighters fought and they lost and then they were raped, and it's better that women don't join politics. So that may be what happens now. And there's also the surveillance, right? And surveillance of the Tamil people will affect women particularly. Surveillance in itself has this ability to sort of break into the psyche and prevent resistance and prevent mobilizing. One person in Jaffna told me the Tamil people are paralyzed by fear. The fear leaves the average woman afraid to walk, afraid to talk, afraid to see something that might be suspicious. You only survive by being deaf, mute, and blind. And so surveillance sort of emerges as one of the most repressive patterns right now for the Tamil people. One soldier sort of bragged to me, oh yeah, we know what people eat for lunch. That level of intimate surveillance, it not only affects the individual, it breaks down ties, right? Families become scared of each other. Sisters, are nervous that somebody's going to tell on them or there's going to be something that happens. I recently did a review of a lot of the testimonies of girls who were ex-combatants who were raped in detention. And the most shocking part was not so much, the rape that happened in detention, was that they all went to bed in the same room and nobody talked to anybody else about what happened. In that room, none of the girls shared what had happened to them, knowing that everybody else had had the same experience. And now post-war too, you have the militarization, which is really useful to overlap with all these other extremist ideologies, extreme Buddhism, extreme nationalism. You had these riots against the Muslim community in the South by extremist Buddhists. And what was fascinating is that the men weren't there. The men were at the mosque, right? It was mostly the women who were home, and it was the women who threw chili powder and threw hot water. It was the women who were present, but in this conversation that happened afterwards, how to prevent Muslim Buddhist extremist violence, someone shared the email chain with me. And it was between moderate monks and moderate Islamic clerics debating about women's burqas. The argument was, well, the black burqas are what's making them under threat because they look like they're connected to the Saudi Islam, and that's why people are throwing stones at them. Let's find another color for them to wear. And this chain of emails was one person suggesting pink and the other one saying that's difficult to keep clean, and so it's un-Islamic. And red might be too bright. And, reading these emails, you're thinking like, how is it that you're having this conversation? How can it be the men who are deciding fundamentally, what happens to these women who are getting stones thrown at them and what they're going to wear? But that was how it was dealt with, in the post-conflict period. So I think the question is, how do you overcome all of these? How do you sort of get to political action in such a deeply repressive moment? Because it's not just Sri Lanka that's a deeply repressive state right now. There's Burma, there's, all kinds of countries that are suffering from the same type of political repression. I think you start with the language. You stop using the word victim, stop using the word empowerment, stop using capacity building. All of these things create the expectation that there will be no political action. Nobody expects a victim to take political action, right? Empowerment, the actual word, means the transfer of power. So you're saying the transfer of power from someone in the West to somebody over there. Capacity building, again, there's the assumption that there is no capacity there on the island in these people. And it is really a rethinking of political power and where it exists, right? It's not women in parliament that's going to do this. It's women in informal political spaces. There was all these women in these community development councils in Afghanistan that nobody ever talks about. We hear about the women parliamentarians, but that actually did some real stuff in changing the political situation of women, right? So it's building the informal political spaces. For questions like justice, are we putting too much emphasis on the power in the international community? Is that the source of power that we want to deal with, particularly when we talk about accountability in Sri Lanka? What if justice, to people in Sri Lanka, to people on the ground, means just knowing whether your relative was missing, dead, detained, just knowing. If it's been 5 years and you don't know where your relative is, what if that looks like justice to you? There was a woman in the camp where I met at the end of the war, and I said, how did you feel when the war was over? And she said, we didn't know, nobody told us. And in a life where, you're a human rights worker and you hear all kinds of terrible stuff, you have these moments that strike you as particularly inhumane, that nobody would tell you that this nightmare was over. And even in the accountability process, what are we doing in this very intrusive search for information? I mean, having been a human rights researcher, you fundamentally have to ask a woman about the very worst thing that's happened to her. And not just that, you need the details. And then you need the proof that this happened. And you need her to help you find all of these things, right? And it occurred to me at one point, I know that we have to do this, I know that we're supposed to gather this evidence, but it occurred to me at one point when I met a woman and she was describing how she was taken and she was raped in Sri Lanka because they thought she had information on the Tigers. She'd been in the movement 2 days or something, right? She didn't have any information because she was in the movement 2 days, but she was raped on that basis. Then she was kept for a while, then she was released. But all of a sudden now she has information because she was raped. So now she becomes a source of information that the military is looking for, that everybody is looking for to make sure she keeps her mouth shut. So she leaves and she comes to London, and all of a sudden she's an even bigger source of information. Everybody wants to talk to her. Diaspora groups find her, and lawyers find her. And at one point she looked at me and she said, and then the phone rang again with somebody asking questions, and I thought, this is torture. And in my head it occurred to me, this was torture, that we were asking her again and again and again the same story. And it's fine, you ask the story once, you get the story. But the same people go back. There are these human rights turf wars over who got the story. Was it Amnesty or Human Rights Watch? And can we get exclusive access to this witness? And she's poaching our witness, and he's poaching our witness. And what did we do with the information we got the first time? I mean, I handed it to Hillary Clinton. I don't think she read it. What do we do with that information? What are we promising her? We're not promising her social programming. We're not promising her we're going to make her life in London easier. We're promising her some elusive notion of social justice. Right? You're not asking her how she's surviving with all of her kids in Sri Lanka in some cold apartment in a London suburb, right? How she has to learn how to use the tube and how difficult her life is now. So all of these things I think you have to consider when you're trying to think about how you create new forms of power and the ways that we're doing it now. Where are we looking for it? And I think we have to be honest about who's mediating the potential political power here. Right? There's a recent piece by Arundhati Roy, and she is excellent. And she only published it, I think, on a Maoist website. But she says that there is this NGOization of resistance, right? What's happened is that NGOs essentially blunt the edges of political resistance. They're giving out by benevolence what people ought to have by political right, right? That has become the role of NGOs. And we have to be honest about who is that broker in between the people and the state that is supposed to provide them rights. It is usually a development community. It is usually, in Afghanistan, it certainly is, in Sri Lanka it was. How do you talk about the politics of aid? There have been all these conversations recently about trafficking and slavery in Cambodia, and everybody wants to talk about Cambodia. Why is nobody talking about the fact that a lot of the clients in Cambodia are aid workers? What does that say about, what we think of women's empowerment if you're looking at this intense sort of look at slavery and sex trafficking, and the consumers are aid workers? Where are the power politics there? Who's involved in that? So I think we're at a stage where we really want to think about building a movement, right? I just did a paper with my husband, an academic paper that looks at women will always resist, regardless of how repressive anything is. So we looked at women under Tiger-controlled and the Sri Lankan state to find examples where, you don't see resistance always with women outside protesting. If you told women in Sri Lanka to do that now, they'd all be shot. That doesn't have to be what resistance looks like. These are examples of women who, a woman who went to find her husband in detention and they couldn't get in, and the group of women couldn't get in and couldn't get in. And finally one of them said, I'm just going to pretend that I'm pregnant. She fainted, pretended she was pregnant, and then the guy let everybody in to see their husbands, right? So she's drawing on these cultural stereotypes to get what it is she wanted. Or a woman who was raped in a village and her husband told her to report it, everybody told her to report it. She chose not to report it because the soldier who did it was controlling the water to the village, and that village was doing very well that season, and she felt that there was a bigger reason to not report this. Those are moments of agency. You will always see women resist. And we've been working a lot recently with people like Gloria Steinem, Kimberly Crenshaw, who are really trying to build a movement of women and create this all as it is one issue that women are facing. Kimberly Crenshaw, obviously, she talks about intersectionality, and she says it's not just that things are conservative or they're nationalist. There is always a patriarchal undertone. How do you deal with both questions? We actually had this interesting conversation where she said that the Black community was really mad that she raised the issue of domestic violence because that somehow detracts from talking about the brutality of the police. And similarly, when I did the report on Sri Lanka, the Tamil community was concerned that I talked about domestic violence because somehow that detracts from the fact that women are being raped by the state, but they don't have to detract from each other. If you're able to look at patriarchy in both its structural repression, they should work together. You can't ignore one in service of another political agenda. Some of these struggles closer together. The Tamil women's struggle and the Black women's struggle are not that far apart. On questions of surveillance, Muslim women are facing many of the same challenges under the post 9/11 U.S. in terms of surveillance as are Black women or Black men by the police, right? So a lot of the same issues are affecting us through different paradigms. There's a woman we're working with in India. She organizes sex trafficking workers. She takes money for sewing machines, a lot of money for sewing machines, and she mobilizes women politically. And I asked her about it, and she said, you cannot get people to fund political mobilization. So we buy sewing machines, and then we mobilize women politically. And that's, I think, what spaces like this have the capacity to do. I mean, a lot of the lectures that I do have been in spaces that you find like-minded individuals that you're able to build these connections, to build a community that goes beyond the Tamil women's struggle. And I'll sort of end with saying that I had the opportunity to be at this very remarkable social justice writers workshop with Kimberly Crenshaw and George Lipsitz and others, and everybody has to read your writing and then they all comment on it. And I had a long essay about 4 Tamil women and the struggles that they had. And they read it and they commented on it, and George Lipsitz said, this is in line with this new research that's happening, and it's called Feeling Good About Feeling Bad. And what's happening now is that we get so much information about terrible stuff happening all over the world. And particularly with women, we rely on this emotive element, right? It's so sad what's happening to her, and her story is so sad, and you should be sad about it. And what happens is now is that people feel bad, and then they feel better that they felt bad about it, but they don't do anything after that, right? So it's feeling good about feeling bad. And what Kimberly Crenshaw, told me is she said it, the essay was beautiful. I felt it, it was, but I want you to squander the emotional capital that you build up. Lose some of that to build up political capital. To, at the end of this, give people a political message, right? Say, this is what I want you to do. This is the action we can take. And you will lose people in doing that because it's an overt political message. But that's what you need to be doing. And I'm hoping, things like today, that is what I want to come out of these types of events, is not that you leave here feeling bad for Tamil women, or feeling good about feeling bad, but that there is an action that comes out of this because these issues are all interconnected. Sexual assault on campus, domestic violence in the Black community, rape in Sri Lanka. These are all linked to structural repression, all linked to patriarchy. So hopefully there will be a bigger conversation that comes out of meetings like this, but also more action that comes out. Thank you. Questions? Comments?
I just have to say that I really enjoyed what you discussed. I think it's a very eye-opener to see a complete different aspect in terms of the different type of approach that we should take in terms of intervention and the need for those institutions to really uphold those women versus just what is the usual status quo that hasn't really done as that fundamental change is really needed. So I really appreciate you coming out. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
And looking at the vast volumes of women that have experienced so many horrible things, hence so traumatized, and then looking at so many NGOs that are in these locations that help in infrastructure type of a way. I mean, what is your view in them possibly not serving the bigger thing with the mental health issues when people have been traumatized so much?
Your question is why they don't deal with mental health?
Yeah, I mean, you probably don't see that very much, I would imagine, because I know in certain regions in Central Africa, the ratio of mental health professionals to medical doctors is just really pretty bad.
I think we saw this a lot in the tsunami. One of the primary responses was that people wanted to do psychiatric work to help people. My sister would know better because she is a psychiatrist, but I think that it should be pretty obvious to people that when, intervention in itself is a damaging thing to people if it's not done well, right? If you just intrude on their community and offer them food for 2 weeks and then leave, right? But intervening into someone's mind for 2 weeks and then leaving is deeply problematic. And I think that's what we saw a lot of, if you're going to do psychosocial work, you build up the universities there, you build up the medical schools, you build up the people who will live there and work there and can continually engage with these people. What happened in the tsunami is we had play therapists, we had, social psychiatrists, everybody coming to Sri Lanka, and they would do these 2-week sessions with kids with, crayons and paper and say, draw the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And, the worst thing that's ever happened to these kids was not the tsunami. They've had pretty shitty lives their whole lives, right? And then all of a sudden you've got 100 crying kids and 2 marginally qualified play therapists who don't know how to deal with this kind of trauma. I don't think that you unearth that kind of stuff and then just walk away, right? So it's not that people aren't concerned with the issue, it's that they have 2 weeks to give to this, so they're going to go for 2 weeks and try and deal with it. But I think it's one of the areas we have to be much stricter about intervening in people's lives in the third world.
One thing that I find interesting is that lately there's been at least more media attention regarding young women from the United States, Canada, several European nations traveling to the Middle East to participate in some of these women's movements, whether it be with ISIS or other groups. And at least what I see on TV is they come from fairly middle class to privileged backgrounds. They're usually second generation immigrants. They didn't suffer directly a lot of the things that you addressed, but yet they choose to go there and participate in things. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think?
I think it's been, in the media a lot, the girls from the U.S. and from France and elsewhere. I think they are a little bit distinct. It sounds like the girls in France who are from the Muslim community genuinely are able to identify with the idea that Islam is being threatened, right, because of the headscarf issue, because of other aspects of it. The girls in the U.S., you're talking about generally a much younger demographic, and there's been a little bit of work done on them by another female scholar, and she says that she finds that these girls, it's really more the adventure narrative, right, and the idea that you could get an adventure out of something, which we see operate in all kinds of repressive contexts, not just ISIS. There is a lot of work, a film I recently commented on that looked at human trafficking within the U.S., and they take these girls from Nebraska who are looking for adventure, who are somehow outside of their class or being bullied or some such thing. And they tell them they can come on the road with them and it's going to be an adventure. And then they're, end up being lifelong sort of prostitutes to truck drivers all across the country, right? So the ones from the U.S., it does tend to be more of an adventure narrative. But again, the female recruits to ISIS, the ones coming from the West and from Europe, maybe like 3-4%, right? So it's problematic to me that we look at this bigger phenomenon through this tiny prism of how it affects us in the U.S., because that's going to give us a misguided reading on why women are joining, because the majority are joining from regional countries. Yes?
You talk about this already, but I just want to know more about it, like you would talk more, a little bit more. I'm wondering, like, you said that like the women in general, they join the movement, join the war, and they fight for the nation rather than their rights, right? And my question is how the government can mobilize them
in which way can they mobilize them to join that movement, right? And the second question is how can the government balance the tension that on the one hand mobilize them, and on the other hand after they gain the peace, and they can control can put the woman into the back into the place that before the war, they satisfied that now they are satisfied that but because from my perspective, during the war they also women also gain the power on the one hand, the power on the other hand, they become more aware of their
more
power.
conscious of the right to.
So how can the government do that?
I think there's two distinct questions. That women that I'm talking about are in non-state groups. They're in rebel groups, revolutionary groups, not governments. And I think that if you look at it from the perspective of a rebel leadership, generally the baseline reason why women are joining, there may have been some activism by women, but it is also instrumental. They need more people. Right now, through that process of women interacting in the movement, they may shape the movement. They may, the Tigers definitely, there was no sexual violence done by the Tigers, which is very rare, which may have been a facet of women being in the movement. Also, there becomes a bigger conversation on rights. Eventually, the Tigers adopted a more sort of feminist narrative where they said this is a part of women's empowerment, joining this movement and being a part of that. The reason they're unable to do it after the war is over is because nobody challenged the fundamental patriarchy that was there. It was always thought we were all going to come together for this one higher cause. We're not going to deal with this individual question of women's issues, right? Nobody ever challenged that during that time because it felt like you couldn't challenge it at that moment. And so what you see in places like Eritrea where they actually won, let's say the Tigers had won, is that women became in charge of social services and women's issues and that kind of stuff, right? They weren't integrated into the political leadership because it requires a completely different way of thinking. It requires a fundamental shift in attitude that wasn't happening because of the war. It was the realities of the war that shaped why women joined. And if you look at the government level, people always talk about the developing world. Look at the sexual assault in the American military. But women joining the American military are going through to be in the military. It is still a very patriarchal space in this country. So that becomes something that's much deeper and much harder to tackle than just the question of can women join or not join. Can you change the mindset of the men who are in that culture, that community, or that military mindset to believe in equal rights beyond how useful it is at the moment of war?
What do you think can be done about the stigma that's sometimes attached to a woman reporting that she was raped? I've heard before that in Indian culture, especially in Italian culture, if a young woman goes to her parents or her family and admits to this, that she can sometimes be shunned completely from the community. What can be done to help these women and kind of change this image?
I think it's true about the Tamil community, but I was just at a sort of town hall for young Black women that Kimberly hosted in New York, and the major issue that they raised that we don't know about half the cases of partner violence, domestic violence, abuse, because they don't report it. I think it is sort of across all cultures that there's a stigma attached to being raped. A lot of it comes from, particularly in feminist, literature, and the way you think about it is that women don't want to admit to themselves that they were in that situation, right? There's a lot of conversation about the outside aspect that people will blame the victim, particularly rape cases on campuses and other things. But the bigger issue, I think, is that women blame themselves. They blame themselves for being in that position. They're afraid that they're going to appear stupid or weak or something, so they won't even tell their friends that this is happening. And so that as an initial starting point for women to start saying it, I worry sometimes that when you use this word voice, I went to Angelina Jolie's conference in London to end sexual violence. And it was horrible, but there was all these NGOs around, and it was like a hackathon to end sexual violence, and you put your hand painting on a wall and you'll end sexual violence, and buy a purse and you'll end sexual violence. And I went around to all these little groups just to see, and I said, well, what are you doing? What is your work doing to end sexual violence? And they said, well, we're uplifting the voices of African women, and we're empowering African women, and we're uplifting their voices and their voices and their voices. And I was listening at all of the conferences, and yes, there was always one African woman who probably normally wears jeans but was wearing traditional clothing. was up there in this sort of group of white women, and she was telling her story, and it was her voice. But the bottom line is that it's our conversation. It's their voices in our conversation. How do you shift it so that the conversation is their conversation, not our conversation? That's what we have to start doing. So the more women that speak out, the bigger sort of critical mass you create to have your own conversation. Yes, friend.
Hi. I'm wondering, when are you going to go back? Are you going to update, your cases and go re-interview folks or anything like that? What's your plan?
I think my mom's looking at me like, you're not going back. No, I'm not going to go back for a little while. There was a point last year that I went back, and I was meeting with some women in the north and some activists, and one of the activists said, it's great that you're here, and it's great, that you're hearing the stories and everything, but we already have us here, and we don't have people out there who can articulate it in such a way that can speak to the State Department and the UN and others. But also I feel like, through this career trajectory, I really have come to understand that what was missing in all of this work was that none of these approaches, policy or aid or academia, were thinking about political rights, about the political rights of these women. Fundamentally, the violence doesn't stop until they have political rights. Right, so the project I'm working on now is actually a 3-year initiative that will probably be at City College, that was funded by the Noble Foundation, that will look at the political impact of sexual violence, purely at that, and start by doing a survey of all of this stuff that we're doing, the livelihood and the chickens and cows, and see if it has any impact in actually changing sexual violence, and then see if there's ways where you don't have to add a lot of money, but you start a different conversation in that room around the sewing machines about grievances, about what their daily lives look like. And I don't expect by mobilizing women politically, they're only going to talk about rape. I think they're going to talk about poverty, they're going to talk about militarization, they're going to talk about all of the issues that shape their lives. So I'm hoping that this 3-year study, which looks at 6 different countries, Sri Lanka is one of them, is something that will have an impact on Sri Lanka, but also far beyond that. I hope it gets rid of words like empowerment and capacity building and changes the way that we look at engaging in these societies and really acknowledging the political identities of women.
So I had this idea of doing a research project in Sri Lanka, but I didn't go through it because it's just not possible. But there are these, the demining programs, post-war demining programs, in which they were employing women to do demining work, to training women, so that's part of that rhetoric of empowerment, like giving these women livelihood. And it was really strange because this is demining work, or mining that was put in by both the military and the LTT. And these women are out there in the land, that the homeland, and demining things, and then bringing back, I guess, incomes. I don't know how much to support their families. And the strange thing there is, like what you just talked about, is how those kinds of spaces, those are facilitated by NGOs doing humanitarian work under these rubrics, but the kinds of conversations that can come out of working with women like that, who are, out there doing this kind of stuff. I don't know. I think I'm just saying rather than asking a question.
No, I think that what's interesting, the way the Sri Lankan government has approached female fighters is very, very disturbing, and it's sort of symbolizing of everything that's wrong with the ones who had a particular skill and maybe would be useful for something like that, they put into these very, militarized roles. But I can remember very clearly being in a hair salon in Colombo and looking at like the front page of the paper and seeing this girl that I knew, actually, a female fighter I'd interviewed, and she was walking in this fashion show with her hair done, and and there was all these commentary in the papers about, isn't it great, they were fighters and now they're models, or now they're, so there is this re-feminizing, but it's not just the government. All the stuff that we do, our idea of taking women from war back to normal is re-feminizing, is re-entrenching in tradition. Sewing machines can't be the only thing that, women know how to do. And when I did this survey of some programs in Sri Lanka, I went around and, I'm not so good at the economy stuff, but this woman was like, how long did it take you to make this big, fluffy wool tablecloth? 3 days. Okay, how much did the material cost? 800 rupees. How much are you selling it for? 1,200 rupees. And outside of the fact that you're in a post-conflict area where people can't afford food and are very likely not going to buy decorative tablecloths, the supply and demand is just completely off, right? But this was the only type of program being given to women. And actually, if you're going to do livelihoods, the issue after the war is going to be cell phone technology. It's going to be, things that actually infrastructure, rebuilding that, radios, that kind of stuff. So if you're going to train them in something that's actually useful. But this tends to be the across-the-board approach, is these tiny, small-scale enterprises for women. Yes?
So you touched on the importance of identity for women in culture groups, but I feel like we tend to, as Western perspectives, put more value to secular feminism than, say, Islamic feminism in the Middle East. And the thing with Islamic feminism is that it's promoting equality within the parameters of Islam. Mm-hmm. And it helps the women there keep their identity. But at the same time, with this entity there, it's not really helping much change. Do you think it's necessary for women to have to give up some identity to promote change in the political realm?
To give up some aspect of their identity? Yeah, I know I've had to. So, yeah. I can say, with completely excluding the Tamil activists who are here today, that I have been in rooms with Tamil politicians, and it's actually been some of the most sexist spaces that I have existed in ever. It is an all-male sort of political space, right? And they have a very difficult time accepting women into that space. And on the one hand, I have a PhD in political science. I can talk to you seriously about militarization or strategy or whatever. But I end up talking about women's issues because you're the only woman in the room, and so that's what you're going to do. There was a project I did for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue to bring the diaspora together around humanitarian initiatives and to sort of mobilize people. So I went around the world and I met various diaspora groups, and I tried to talk about this question of gender inclusion, right? And it was just fascinating. And the response from men generally was either, well, they're welcome to come, or they would sort of drag these poor two aunties in to sit in the corner and clearly did not want to be there and weren't actually included in this conversation politically, and then they would come up to me afterwards and talk to me. So yeah, at moments you will always have to make that decision, and I'm comfortable with doing both, but if you are sort of a grassroots activist, it's very difficult to push a political agenda and also push women's rights, and also somebody like Kimberly Crenshaw can do it because she's Kimberly Crenshaw, but yeah, you will have to choose a moment.
So what do you think about women kind of using femininity as a political tool to gain results? I mean, you brought the example of the woman who pretended to be pregnant to kind of get visitor rights. I think there are a lot of examples of how that has proven to be successful, but do you think in the long run that kind of hurts women by perpetuating these gender roles? I mean, after a movement has or has not been successful?
I think that it depends on the context. I think that I fundamentally believe that any human being, women included, under a certain amount of repression will always resist. But it is a question of your individual sort of desire to take a calculated risk, right? If that woman had 3 children, is she likely to challenge the soldier overtly? Or does it make more sense for her to pretend that she's pregnant? Because what if he comes after your children then, right? So I think that it is but I don't think you can use the lens of feminism. I think that becomes an individual woman. It's a part of feminism to allow women to make individual choices, to have gender equity in all aspects, including political choice. So if her political choice was that she didn't want her children to die, so she co-opted gender roles to get what she wanted, I think, there's not a better or worse there. Other questions? Yeah.
So every year here at USC, I have so many students come into my office who are brilliant, who are socially engaged, who are filled with all the best intentions, who want to change the world. And many of them want to work in NGOs, many of them want to work at the United Nations. If they were to come to you, what would you tell them in terms of advice on how to channel everything, all the talents and gifts that they have towards an end that doesn't have as many sort of systemic issues perhaps as NGO culture or the United Nations? Or are there NGOs or divisions within the United Nations that you would say they're actually the ones that are doing work that we should be promoting? That's the model.
Yeah. Well, I just gave a talk at Vassar, and a lot of the students, it's actually at my husband's class, and they had just read Mamdani and Samantha Power's and this critique of humanitarianism. So after my talk also, then they were like, okay, so we're just all going to become academics. And I was like, no, that's not what we want. What we want is to have a next generation that is more critical, that goes into these groups more critical, but not just more critical, but conscious of the politics, right? If the group you want to work for is called Save the Something, but is actually funded by the Defense Department, what are the politics of that group? Do you share those politics? Do you want to be a part of that sort of political agenda? Or is it a privately funded group? Does it have a Christian mission? These are all things that you can find out. People choose not to because there's very good, videos for invisible children or something, and that's something that you feel like, is doing great work because they have $1 million marketing campaign. So to do some research first into these groups, what their politics is, where the money comes from, how much of the money goes to the programs. But second, I did this talk at Swarthmore and everybody was like, how do we save Sudan? And I said, you don't. You don't. You're 17 years old, you're 18 years old, you live in Philadelphia. How do you work within your community in Philadelphia? These are complex political issues. It's great that we have a more engaged world intellectually, globally, all of those things, but you have to learn about a country, you have to think about a country, you have to study a language. You don't want to be the generation that did what, probably the generation before you and before me even did, which is just to go into these countries and apply various frameworks that you thought would make sense and actually make it worse than it was before, So what I advise students generally is, and which is probably not good advice if you want to become an academic, you're not supposed to focus on one country, but I was always told to work on countries other than Sri Lanka for my career, for everything. But Sri Lanka is what matters to me. It's what I care about. It's what drives me. These women drive me. I want their voices to show us something about all of the women in the world. But I know Sri Lanka. I've studied it. I've thought about it. I've, been there. I've spent time there. And even then, if there's a question I don't know, I'm always learning about that. I've been to Pakistan. I've been to Afghanistan. Generally, I won't speak on Pakistan or Afghanistan because there are people who are experts at this stuff, So whether it's an issue or a country or a region or whatever, put the time into it to be able to come up with the right solutions. And then you'll already, in that time, you'll figure out who the groups are doing good work, who the local activists are that need support, what are the regions that are getting less attention because you've thought about it and you've studied it.
Because you do write in terms of, you're involved with think tanks and things like that, what do you think is the link that's missing between creating that research and then being able to actually, that research actually being applied into some form of, activity with regards to policymakers? As you said, you handed that directly to Hillary Clinton. What can you do to actually do something out of it?
One of the problems is we don't speak the same language. Policy people, academics, activists, we don't speak the same language. We did a conference once on refugee camps where we tried to bring together activists, academics, NGOs on just how to rebuild refugee camps so they're more humane. We've had the same camps for 200 years. And it really almost broke down to physical fighting between people. People are so invested, NGOs were so invested in the idea that they're only there to do good, that they're not political. The academics needed to highlight that there was a political element to what they were doing. The policy people had to keep it technical. They had to say, how does this actually, convert into programming and that sort of thing. One of the things I'm hoping this new project does is bring these disparate sort of spaces together. It shouldn't be that a policy group looks down on somebody who's an activist. It shouldn't be that people who are doing thoughtful work at the UN are told that they're too academic. Anywhere where there is good work, where there are useful insights based on people's lives, we should be able to adopt that into programming. So I think the first step is we'll have to speak the same language. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys so much for coming today.